Hello everyone, today we talk about 14th and 15th century artillery and observe its capability in siege warfare. As you know, we also from some videos that we already made on artillery warfare during the late medieval times, artillery was fundamentally conceived primarily and employed also primarily for siege warfare. Open field use was in pitched battles also did exist. You can argue that not just handguns but properly also artillery was employed since kind of the very first. But that was kind of an exception, if you want. They started to use it also in open field because, hey, we have it, it's a gun, it kills, it can do, but it didn't practically make a big deal of difference in pitched battles until the 16th century, essentially. Nevertheless, also siege warfare at this time, albeit seeing a sharp increase in the usage of artillery, was still not really decisively influenced by the same. So that first of all, what we'll see fundamentally today is that you needed so many artillery pieces to make a kind of an effect shooting all together, because the main problem is that singularly these pieces, aside from these strategical problems, that these were enormously expensive weapons for the time, so it was a problem to create them, to produce them, to find them in this sense, also to field them, logistically speaking. I made a video some time ago that is Renaissance artillery, technical and logistical problems, 15th to the 16th century. Is roughly the same thing. Also in 15th century artillery types, bombards, Vogler, serpentine, culverins, crapado, mortars, etc. We explained fundamentally how the evolution also of certain guns that are later known by their name to have been kind of larger guns originally were kind of small, and they mostly differed in function rather than in actual size, because they could vary in here, and everything was, by the way, wildly unstandardized, as you can imagine. So the tactical problems, however, properly were poor range, poor accuracy, and therefore all what this entailed, because aside from the strictly, by the way, these guns could shoot very slowly. They usually broke down. Actually, it was the norm to have a gun breaking down after a certain couple of shots. So you literally sometimes had just a couple of shots and then the thing broke down and you already knew it. The other big problem was considering the range was the effective possibility of defending these guns on the field. That is, fundamentally, they had to be brought very close to the walls in order to produce an effect of certain kind, to be more precise, to inflict more damage, and naturally this exposed them at eventual sorties and other assaults, and the same other weapons maybe were not artillery but still had an effective range of a couple of 100 meters, like crossbows at that time, and also guns that were handguns that were developed, and other guns naturally, because artillery was starting being mounted also on the walls of besieged fortresses, but also handguns, etc. So we will see now. We'll make a list of sieges where and observe how artillery was in fact used. But you see that in most of them that have also a pretty interesting military history on their own, tactical history, and also historical relevance in general. You will see we will see that effectively artillery didn't have all this, at least not at all times, especially in its small numbers, generally a decisive influence on the outcome, because they weren't decisive for the outcome, because chiefly at that point was a logistical problem. of the fortresses, etc. Even if you could bomb them, with this thing it was mostly still about the main variables was how many troops were defending, attacking, what the general structure of the fortresses was. Naturally, between the 14th and the 15th century, things started to change, and artillery accelerated in this sense. Also the transformation of fortresses in general, as we know. I made a video also on the title being 15th century origins of the traces italiennes. That takes into consideration exactly this passage, this transformation. On other occasions, we will see that they were actually effective. That is, their artillery fundamentally now, if brought in consistent number and especially operated all together, could cause damages, not just from a sheer material point of view, but just even throwing the enemy in confusion enough to, allow other operations to be carried out, assaults, other stuff, so that or to weaken sensibly even the buildings within the fortresses, sometimes causing fires, the massive destructions of, I don't know, warehouses, stuff like that, and to make the assailant progressing towards a happy outcome, let's say, even though it was, even operating it, as we will see, it was pretty slow. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. Kind of poor introduction, as all the introductions that I don't thoroughly plan. However, let's go to the in medias res. So, first of all, there is an aspect on the spread of artillery that has to be taken into consideration. That is, fundamentally, as soon as artillery was conceived in terms of, being able to adapt certain materials to shoot, certain tools to shoot these projectiles due to the explosion of black powder, artillery spread immediately. There is fundamentally no boundary, if not in terms of the strictly strategical capabilities. I mean, considering the logistical, the problem, actually the same local resources, because not all communities in Europe could produce artillery at the same time. Especially artillery was to be found in Western Europe, in this very highly advanced centers that were developing for many reasons, especially from the cities, because also the very first artisans that were capable of, they had the technology for producing even barrels and stuff like that, were from cities. It's not surprising, for instance, that seemingly the path opener in this sense were initially actually the Italians and the also in the Mediterranean, the Mamluks. You find basically explosive shells immediately employed at this point, so there is no barrier. The effects of these guns were kind of immediately understood. Then by the 15th century, what you have is, from the Flanders, for instance, a big deal of artillery, but in there are there are other factors that are mainly also political, because you find that in the Duchy of Burgundy, that owned Flanders at this point, had expanded to them. There was an enough politically and socially structured power that could, first of all, acquire these guns in a way or in another, because these were normally bought. In fact, they weren't, I think, anything like real foundries of ducal foundries, like in that case, but definitely there were now kind of ducal arsenals. That so this Central European power of the Valois Bourgogne dynasty rising consistently, having these organizational capabilities and being able to to field a permanently, at least stably, a certain amount of guns, that in this sense started also to tend towards a higher degree of standardization that, as we have seen, was kind of a difficult thing to achieve. Even before France, that France at the end of the period now, at the thresholds of the 16th century, was considered to be kind of the most to own actually and correctly, in fact, the largest and most powerful park of artillery in Europe. This is not because France, maybe, I don't know, had the best technologies, because these probably were somewhere else. They were probably in places like Italy or Flanders, etc. But the real point was that now France was an enough structured state, just like Burgundy, before this was wiped out and conquered by the same French, to actually organize with a military administration, with a military bureaucracy and stuff like this, the fielding also of these guns. Because the main problem was not having the technology actually, or buying this, because this could simply be bought, so it was not a big deal, but actually having the money for acquiring it, but for fielding it. Because having an artillery train at this point was something extremely demanding in many ways, not just in terms of sheer resources to be consumed just for the artillery, but also considering the way it influenced the same strategies sometimes, mostly negatively, because carrying these guns with you entailed huge logistical problems that we have exposed in those videos I mentioned to you before, especially the first one. Then naturally there was the obvious tactical advantage of having a very sound firepower that you could employ chiefly against the fortresses of the time that, by large, aside from also in here the most advanced countries, had not yet adapted in terms of military engineering to such firepower, to such technology, and that were in fact to develop increasingly towards that direction, for obvious reasons. But the point I wanted to make is that as soon as artillery started being fielded, actually the size of this artillery was from the start very varied. There were so many small, medium, and large sized guns that were used at the same time. Sometimes it was even difficult, as we were saying before, to distinguish a handgun from a cannon, fundamentally, because this is observable even for certain types of arquebuses or muskets eventually that had actually evolved from same kind of artillery. Originally speaking, the musket and other and arquebuses, etc., had developed as mobile artillery. They weren't developing from smaller guns that eventually were lengthened, but it was the other way around. But also in here everything was very much complicated, because aside from the terminology that, okay, we know in the case of arquebuses and muskets that I don't know, the arquebuses were something of a certain kind, came earlier than they transformed into muskets. But aside from the fact that there is this middle ground that we don't really know, especially for terms of because of problems of terminology, whether the sources are actually talking what they are actually talking about, because also technically speaking there is not a huge difference. But the lack of standardization sometimes made you say, what the hell these guns were. I mean, you may find the name of a gun in the sources, but not really understanding what it is. And this varied wildly, by the way, in the parts of Europe, because in certain regions a certain type of gun was called in a way, or in another it was full of several names, also in the various vernacular languages in order to define it. So whoever has studied those particular problems knows that the aside from the specialization that naturally has to occur at a certain point in terms of what is that you want to do with these guns, and okay, you can spot these obvious differentiations in handguns, in bombers, in mortars, etc. There are still all around, all within, overlapping all these kind of gray areas where you realize that it was a freaking lot of experimentalism, and actually so many different types of guns that, however, when it came to the matter of fielding them, they were used, in fact, in a pretty versatile way. And objectively, it's like an outdated gun. It's not that cannot be competitive or may not be designed specifically for a certain context, but it still works. It's still something that shoots a projectile with an overwhelming force against a target that's several 100 meters of distance at a certain point. That can be useful, and this was kind of the idea, even though now I said several hundred meters. Actually, the very first guns naturally didn't even have such a range, and this really depends also on what kind of guns they were. Also, if every trajectory, for instance, is parabolic, but you realize that mortars had a very different trajectory with a much more more markedly parabolical trajectory than I don't know, a long barrel gun that has fundamentally to shoot straight ahead and to pierce possibly at 90 degrees a wall, a perpendicular, a wall that is perpendicular to the ground, or at least to the shot, because towards the end of the period there is also this problem that fortresses are starting to adapt to the inclination of to kind of contrast the effectiveness of this artillery with the inclination of the walls, so that you see, in fact, that the Trace Italienne does exactly this, in many other aspects, and therefore that in turn triggered a further specialization that naturally is both cause and effect of the same thing. So the two things are actually deeply intertwined. It doesn't even make a lot of sense to ask what came first and what's the answer, and vice versa. And it's during this period, let's say, especially from the end of the 14th century, the last decades of the 14th century, that all these huge variety of guns was, let's say, was averagely used at this point during siege warfare in Europe. You can obviously see these higher concentrations in Western Europe than the Eastern one, but fundamentally these guns started being used in there. The first there is a geography, let's say, a time in which fundamentally this, at least we have the first witnesses of the appearance of guns in certain areas of Europe. By the 70s or the 80s of the 14th century, we have the first evidence of guns in places like, I don't know, I remember Poland now. In other countries, like very first evidence is in Italy, somewhere in Tuscany, in the beginning of the 14th century. So you realize that this kind of took a different path, but that mostly depended on socio-economical problems, even more than political, because guns could be used now by kind of everyone. I mean, it doesn't take you to be a kingdom to use a gun, and just even a city-state can use one. Actually, they often use them even before the kingdoms sometimes, and therefore what is striking in many ways at this time in military history is the homogeneity of these guns. I mean, there weren't many differences at this time in European warfare as a whole. Fundamentally, Europeans at this time, aside from certain ethnicisms that existed mostly in two areas of Eastern Europe, etc., were fundamental. They had fundamentally the same kind of military. It's true that towards this phase, especially in the 15th century, there are new kind of modern armies that are being formed, but in the essentials, let's say that tactically speaking, there wasn't a big deal of difference anywhere. And also in technology, you can talk about a relative symmetry in this context. Sorry. So in siege warfare, you find as a rule, not as a law, but definitely as a rule, the presence of such guns of every size that were normally employed altogether for the siege and also the storming of strongholds. And what is particularly interesting is that you can see also with other military technologies of the time is that the employment of such weapons was fundamentally very dynamic. It was much less dynamic later. I mean, later during the modern age, you start having this, batteries that were kind of conceived to function all together. They were kind of, more expensive. They were also manned, usually also by certain crews that had escorts, etc. There was a kind of a more staged employment of these guns. But originally speaking, this wasn't like that, and there was for this very reason a much greater tactical, let's say, maybe not really, I can't really pose it in these terms, but let's say that there was a very high tactical synergy that entailed especially the use of these guns in the moment of the storming of the citadels. Not always. Of course, there were bombings that could happen, kind of bombardments, let's say, that could happen at all time, and in a moment where there was not an attack. But it was fundamental, and this remained kind of at all times, eventually, since always, the need of bombarding immediately just before the attack. And as we'll see, these guns were used also to cover the operations of pioneers and stuff like that. So since the very beginning, you have a very deep engagement of the fire of this of these weapons with the other operations that sometimes had not even to do with combat proper, but were fundamentally to be understood, like, for certain siege other like siege work and other stuff like that. So there is a kind of a change that we're hinting at now from roughly the 70s and the 80s of the 15th century, when which is a phase where we start having kind of satisfactorily safe data that can show us effectively what was effectively the intensity of bombardments through these guns and during sieges, in fact. So these are kind of the only from the sources, the only military episodes were from which you can assess the firepower at this point, because you realize that this was the moment when they were concentrated, when fire was so concentrated, more concentrated compared to any other one, fundamentally, that you could find around, because there was sieges were usually a long business. The targets were kind of very, very evident, because you had to bomb a fortress or possibly concentrating fire into it. You had, in fact, several guns shooting at once against immobile targets, idling targets. So even if definitely from especially these very years, even handguns start actually making some difference into tactically speaking in pitched battles. You in parallel, you have in siege warfare this more standardized tactics of massive bombardment in order to not just to achieve a destruction that obviously was what was the ultimate objective, but also to cause some shock, some psychological effect. This is particularly important. Artillery at some point doesn't even have an actual destructive aim, but it's mostly in order to create a psychological effect. This is actually something that came to exist, especially in pitched battles, until very late in time. I mean, artillery, even if you think about Napoleonic times, wasn't actually conceived in pitched battles to kill people. It was just conceived to scare them, in order to disband their ranks and to make them. That's why also ricochet fire was used, because the point was not falling straight ahead in the enemy formation, but actually messing up the first lines of the enemy, making them show these balls bouncing in front of them, and therefore making the soldiers of the first lines move and shift because they freaked out. But this is a digression. So let's start with some examples to really understand what we're talking about. So the first one is the 1407/8 siege of Maastricht. This was a rebellion against the local bishop that was besieged. Eventually, the fortress fell, and the Duke of Burgundy had to intervene at the point to put things in order once again. And Maastricht at the time actually had some fortifications that dated back to fundamentally the 13th century. Remember that Europe had this momentary phase of contraction, for which also the great things had been during the 13th century, and during the 14th maybe not so much, or at least certain works had been kind of reduced in size. So Maastricht was actually well defended. It had a series of these strong ramparts from 1229, then being outgrown in the 1290s, and also other the perimeter was closed with a strong stone wall, wet moat, and even a stream that joined the south in the city. So it was actually a pretty interesting fortification. And what you find is that on November 1407, from November the 24th, 1407 to January the 7th, 1408, over the city fell 1,514 large stone balls shot by bombards. So these are fundamentally just something like it's a month and a half, and you have therefore 1,500 shots, which makes actually a pretty modest average of 33 shots in a day, but at the time it was still massive as a bombardment. So 33 shots in a day is just fundamentally a bit more than one in an hour, and it doesn't seem much, but these were really the loading times of these guns. We have seen also that it was a problem to have them working without breaking. So we can imagine that a big deal of during the employment was based on finding the best possible spot to hit, in order not to give those precious shots, to make those precious shots wasted. Nevertheless, this was a very heavy bombardment for the structures that evidently now were kind of outdated, fortifications from the 13th century that could not withstand now the new forces that artillery was bringing in, the destructive forces that artillery was bringing in. um, and what is interesting about this siege is that the bombardment actually became um, uh, this first bombardment didn't actually make a big difference at the beginning. The bishop within the city kept resisting, so this was not the culmination of the siege. Actually, it was just a preemptory, show of force fundamentally. And and by the way, the besieged kept striking back. As a matter of fact, um, the rebels were hoping for a quick capture that would happen soon. Instead, it wasn't the case. The siege went on, in fact, up to I don't remember when. Actually, I think it was in July even. And in fact, it was on the night of July 1408 that 100 heavy stones were shot all at once during the same night. So this was the real, actually, the further increase of the rate of fire that demolished other buildings, etc. And from this. From this point onwards, the besiegers started understanding that there wasn't much they could do fundamentally, and they were to surrender actually in September. So you understand what the time length now really was. I mean, it was a very long time, and you can't think that the artillery basically played a let's say a decisive role, but rather kind of a determining one, given that this resistance kept going on, and it was at that point just a matter of internal capabilities. Also, I don't have other data in here, but fundamentally also problems of having relief and also storming the city, because you can also bombard it and destroy it, but if there is someone still fighting in it, you have some problem. That's why the bombardment was probably a very heavy thing, because it showed that even buildings within the city could be destroyed, and that was important because destroying the structures within the city equated to reduce the resistance in terms of just environmental reasons, whatever the attackers had managed to hit, etc. But yet it took months before the thing came to an end. Then there is the very famous siege of Orléans in 1428. It was the kind of the climatic moment of the Years' War. As you know, this was basically the last stand of the French monarchy before annihilation. The French managed with reinforcements. I mean, the English started besieging the city that was pretty large, and they couldn't basically. This was a great problem, because logistically speaking, when you besiege someone, you have to outstretch your forces in a certain way if you want to prevent that city to be supplied, because the problem is, it doesn't make sense to besiege a city that can't get supplied. So the English actually took time, because they were actually superior in terms of who was within the city, but eventually the French reinforcements arrived, and there was all this fight around the forts that the English had built around the city. And also in here, artillery was used in the same fashion with these bombardments. There is the Journal du Siège, which tells us that on Sunday, on October the 17th, 1428, the English launched into the city of Orléans 124 stones from bombards and cannons. So also in here, in one day, 120 balls hitting inside the or at least stones of us. Yeah, at this time they were kind of all spheric for being launched by bombers and cannons, hit inside the city. That is a lot. Just imagine, even now, even if that naturally doesn't represent much of an effective destructive power in today's world, considering the military average. But just think about, what this very heavy stones. It could be very, very heavy sometimes, like even tens of kilos, as we will see in a while, falling. Like 100 of these on your houses, in your houses. Just figuring is now looking at the window. It must be, impressive, and especially for a time where, as a matter of fact, there weren't many other destructive powers out there. Because at that point, artillery was like the most destructive thing ever, could ever be employed, at least as a weapon. In that context, yet then you can do worse things, like if you break a dam or if you set up a fire. But artillery, in this sense, was used in a very calibrated way and could have devastating effects, nevertheless. And in fact, one of these stones, at least some of these stones, could weigh up to over 50 kilos. 116 pounds. It's a freaking heavy thing. I mean, I don't think I'm able to lift 50 kilos. Well, yeah, maybe I'm able to, but just imagine that mass. Smashing. Of course, I should be able. I hope I'm able to shift 50 kilos. But just think that thing projected like hundreds of meters away. Just think about, first of all, the force that is required to do that, and just think about the effect, even when loaded with, aside from the shot, but also loaded with gravity. When 50 kilos fall on you, it's something pretty devastating. But yet, none of them were, and possibly not all of them were. And by the way, this fact that the projectiles were different in size already tells you by itself that they were evenly shot by different guns, because in order to shoot, you can, even these guns sometimes were also loaded with different stuff. There was still already a kind of mitraille that could be employed. But let's say that if you wanted to have a clear, precise shot, you had to cast, not to cast, but at this point to sculpt balls that were consistently, the size of the caliber, fundamentally, and they were fitting the caliber, and therefore could be shot more effectively. Also, because otherwise you would have lost completely. I mean, all the force, the great part of the force at least, and the precision, etc. So this means that there were naturally bombers and cannons of different size, firing all at once. Then there is this other episode, that is the siege of Lagny in 1431. This is another occasion where artillery was used, and always into the. This should be Lagny-sur-Marne, actually, and this was in fact an occasion where 412 stone cannonballs were fired into the town in a single day. So you see here the size, even in a relatively, actually not very few years, but how even the amount of shot of projectiles shot in a single day was increasing. So you can even kind of sense the progress that was being carried out, was being achieved by these powers. In whichever way it was, we don't know whether there were now more guns or more projectiles or more resources invested. We don't know, but surely there was the capability that maybe up to 50 years before was considered impossible for even for the strongest power at the time. This was still during the 100 Years' War, I think. I don't remember now I wanted to find something. It was fundamentally a French victory against the English. So it was fundamentally also a French defense. Yes. So there was adverted after Orléans, the English presence now was to outstretch into France. So the French start concentrating their forces, regaining all, but also still defending themselves from other comebacks of the English. Then at Dinant in 1466, we know that in the week between August the 19th and the 26th, the city was targeted by 502 balls and 1,200 serpentine shots. So this is massive. Instead, it's 30 years later, and consistent advancements had been achieved in the field of artillery technology. So you see here that you have for 7 days 1,700 shots. So from the a lot has changed from the 14th century, hasn't it? This is more or less an average of 242 shots per day. So it's a hell of a rate of fire. The siege of Dinant at this time was carried out by the Burgundians, now the Duchy of Burgundy, by Philip the Good, against this wealthy city. So now here you see an increased firepower that is at the service at that time of one of the most advanced militaries in Europe, in order to storm a city, a wealthy city and that represents in a certain sense also the political particularism of the Middle Ages being flattened fundamentally towards the modern age by this also military means, that this greater let's say proto-statal entities were reflecting, were able to carry out also throughout a more centralized administration, bureaucracy, and therefore also military organization. There are many other events at this point in the second half of the 15th century that start becoming really countless, of sieges where artillery had a massive firepower. One of them was the siege of Rhodes, shifting ourselves into moving into the Eastern Mediterranean. This, which is a failed attempt of the Ottomans to conquer the Hospitalier stronghold, and that's so a major employment of artillery. This is particularly important because the Turks, as we have seen in some other videos that we made on them, particularly the Ottomans actually, and especially the Ottomans, were very quick to adopt, compared to other Muslim powers, artillery, and to make a very dynamic use of it in any way. The Turks kept this unbroken artillery fire from the certain point onwards, that was supported by infantry made. And that was supporting infantry-made attacks that were carried out in series. This was a typical Turkish tactics that now they were using for as an expanding power, as they were now in fact storming so many citadels and fortified places that in order to expand their domains, the Turks became, by the 16th century especially, the masters in these tactics. Their favorite tactics was mining, making a big explosion to make the walls blowing up, starting fire, which is mostly suppression fire, and making the janissaries stormtroopers, in fact, assaulting the enemy. And this is the kind of the same tactics that remain unburied until even in World War I, that were exactly the same. So, just to make you understand how the use of artillery was very dynamic since the very beginning. It was conceived as such, also for not just for the sake of destruction, but also for supporting actually other operations, like in fact, especially infantry during sieges, infantry assaults to the walls. Roads during the Turkish siege had to suffer the shot of 3,500 balls. By the way, this is a siege that lasted from May the 23rd to August the 17th, right? So this is, let's make a quick count. It's 68 plus 17. It's 85 days, if I'm not wrong. And so making a very quick count, we arrive to a concentrated fire of 41, of an average at least, of 41 shots per day for almost 3 months. So it's really impressive, and only against only one target. So just imagine this. Interestingly enough, and this reveals you how during the 15th century still, however, artillery wasn't quite decisive. Not only the Ottomans lost, but we know that they suffered something like around, because I don't think the estimates are accurate, but around, the number is impressive, 9,000 killed and 15,000 wounded, compared to the Hospitaliers' losses that were very few, although I think they are unknown. And we're talking about an army of 70,000 Ottomans with hundreds of ships, and that fought against something like not more than 3,000 to 4,000 soldiers within Rhodes. So this is also the relative effectiveness of artillery that still hasn't in the 1480s managed to go beyond more than. But yet the Ottomans were expanding pretty fast, also introduced artillery everywhere. Constantinople fell famously because of those same bombers. So this was starting making a difference for real, especially for a centralized power like the Ottomans were basically were basically creating, and this especially strategic aggressivism that saw naturally artillery as a primary asset in order to quicken the process of storming enemy strongholds. Also because, as you clearly understand, sieges were extremely expensive. I mean, keeping an army like in this case of 70,000 people around one fortress is it costed, I believe, way more than the artillery that was fielded. So you don't want to prolong the siege for too long. There were many problems. The outbreak of epidemics, logistics is not something you can kid with. So this was, on average, from a strictly strategical point of view, a way to quicken the also certain strategical goals, in fact, as well as the tactical ones, actually. And in fact, this is also what we have to concentrate on, that there was still at this point in the late 15th century a kind of a pessimistic attitude towards artillery. Leaving aside the cultural criticism that could be done about artillery, the problem now of being a kind of an unchivalrous weapon and all this stuff, that is kind of very idealistic, because at the time actually artillery spread without many difficulties. And so you always have to distinguish in history to detach ideals from reality, because as we know, actually, even for the most chivalrous fighters and armies of the time, guns were something perfectly normal to employ. But in general, this was this idea that artillery was not reliable as a weapon, and this was true because of the technical problems that we have discussed before. It broke down easily. It costed a lot. It was ineffective. It had a very slow fire rate, very short range still. So some chroniclers rightfully point out that sometimes with surprise, with embarrassment, that some batteries that were fielded and that they had to do had to do who knows what, actually were pretty much ineffective. But this starts being paired more and more frequently by instead news of destroyed buildings, burned quarters, large breaches opened into the walls. So there was a work in progress, let's say, a refinement of this technology and of its employment. As we had hinted before, one of the main objectives of artillery was to create a suppression fire in order to protect the pioneers and engineers during the works, the siege works, chiefly for the digging of trenches that also at this time were being developed as to military engineering in a way that could also reduce the effects of artillery in itself, and albeit trenches were used also in order to approach the enemy walls. In fact, avoiding the same fire. That's why during the modern age also there is this kind of zigzag trench fashion, was in fact conceived in order to build the trench along a line that was put with the higher angle as possible from artillery fire, so that it was kind of difficult more difficult to be hit instead approaching the walls, because at this time one of the most effective tactics was to mine the walls, to undermine the walls, making them blowing up. And sometimes that was the only option, because even with artillery it was difficult. By the way, artillery at some point could also we've seen how that fire rate was pretty slow, so sometimes you could even make a wall crumble, but the besieged could, albeit with some emergential measure and probably not extremely refined work, however, fill that gap, to fill that breach, and in creating another problem, because at that point the assailants couldn't in fact pour into the breach anymore. This had been a problem also of the previous siege machineries that had existed, and so other suppression fire, by the way, could be used also to make the to make certain soldiers approach the enemy walls or ditches, so to even be, as we were saying before, more dedicated for actually supporting the actual assault. And Jean de Bouille, in the mid 15th century, recommends to shoot with the bombers first and then with the Vogler. That is this smaller caliber artillery, without an interruption between the two typologies. So this is particularly important because this was a way to prolong fire in a functional way. So what Jean de Bouille was saying was essentially shoot with bombers first, because those are bigger guns. They can make the necessary damage, breaking the walls, opening breaches, and stuff like that. Then start shooting with the Voglers, with the smaller ones, because those were kind of more tactical in some way. They could be used for more direct suppression fire. In fact, what is interesting in this sense is what I was telling you before is that aside from the bombers, were being developed even increasingly smaller cannons that were also that could be portable, sometimes on wheels, sometimes they were toted literally there. And therefore could be deployed, being smaller, so more more easily transportable, closer to the enemy, and therefore operating also from a closer distance, so that you could give a more surgical support to, in that case, a stormtrooper that had to assault the walls. This also, the Ottomans incidentally were developing certain types of cannons. These were particularly useful because sometimes they could be brought literally even within the same walls, over the same walls of the enemy, and you could mount them practically everywhere, which is pretty smart. It's as if you had an accompanying gun. Of a gun of accompaniment that you can kind of mount everywhere. And in fact, there were these small platoons that were deputed to exactly to move this smaller kind of artillery. So what Jean de Bouille is saying here, shoot in this fashion altogether. So basically, you keep fire on all the time, and you essentially don't even give time for the enemy to cope with the situation, because let's assume you have breached the walls. At this point, you don't give rest to the enemy. You breach the wall. You don't give time to the enemy to prepare for the assault there. And whether they do, if they are able to arrive there quickly enough, etc., you still have the Voglers shooting at them singularly, and therefore keeping this concentrated fire on there to leave a gap open where your soldiers can hopefully pour in. By the way, Jean the Fifth de Bouille was known as Le Flot des Anglais, which means the plague of the English, the scourge of the English. He was born in 1405 and died in 1478, so he had been through naturally this very important phases of military history during the later part of the 100 Years' War, and he had gained this experience. In fact, it was the moment in which artillery kind of made some further progress. But it's interesting to see how also many of the evidence that is available, much of the evidence available for following this kind of developments of artillery, etc., fire rate, come from France chiefly. Both because it was naturally the battleground of the Hundred Years' War, at least the main battleground, but also because both France and Burgundy, and also England in part, but chiefly France and Burgundy, were developing artillery consistently. Were employing it as always more regularly, and basically the French had this very put very quickly an end to the Years' War, also thanks to their own artillery that basically saved them from the tactical disasters that they were obtaining in open ground against the English longbow. So in a certain sense, gunpowder should be tanked by the French in this sense, and they were quite keen on it. By the way, it's very fascinating because France at this time was, and Burgundy especially, the most chivalrous country in Europe. So you might expect artillery was disdained in there. No, strangely enough, not. Infantry was way more disdained. What is interesting about France is that they arrived at the thresholds of Renaissance warfare, of modern history, and kept during Renaissance warfare despising infantry and not actually developing an infantry on their own that could cope with, let's say, the Swiss, the Spanish ones, which was very bad because actually France had the strategical assets to field a freaking lot of men. At that time, demography this was very important. France had lots of people that could be hired in these massive infantry formations at that time were developing. Instead, they didn't, because the nobility deemed at this point that would have been too anti-aristocratic, in fact. Yet they developed artillery consistently. So the French army was mostly famous at this point for its cavalry, notoriously, its heavy cavalry, but also for its own artillery. Jean de Bouille was Count of Sancerre, Viscount of Carentan, Lord of Montresor, Château-Lavallière, Saint-Calais, Vaujour, Rousset, Vailly. So he was a big guy. Let's say in the situation, and he, by the way, there was even this kind of familiar traditions sometimes were definitely done because his father was killed, Jean IV of Bouille, at the Battle of Agincourt. Interestingly enough, so you see that these are really sons of their own times, and they were bred in blood, if you want. By the way, the reality of warfare this time was really terrific in many ways, and in fact, Jean V is famous also because he wrote a semi-autobiographical novel known as Les Jovencelles, and that into which basically he writes about his own. He based himself on the experiences that he had during the 100 Years' War in itself. So, and he had a very interesting record. He fought among other things when he was still very young at the Battle of Verneuil. That is one of the most important and also underrated battles of the 100 Years' War, and he was, well, you can find a bibliography of his quite easily on the internet, but just keep in mind that this was a person who definitely understood the craft of arms and knew what he was talking about. So in fact what he writes here is pretty logical and pretty acceptable, and that's objectively the best thing you can do. What do? You shoot against walls with the small guns, then with the bigger ones when you have created a breach. Not really, it's the other way around. You keep fire continuously and possibly obviously concentrated, to support your infantry, so that you can attempt the approach to the walls. This was not always possible, by the way, so it wasn't easy. There was all a craft revolving about revolving around finding the right moment where to hit, assessing the enemy, because, by the way, at this point was even difficult to understand what was happening in general behind the enemy walls, what the resistance could be. Even urban warfare, once you had entered into the walls, you didn't really know what there could be there. There could be barricades and so on. This is a moment in which also the professionalism was very important. Men at arms, in this sense, had a very important role, not just on horseback, but also as infantry, because during siege warfare you have to get into the cities, fighting at close range. So you had to be, this is the same time full plate armor developed, so you had to go in there with kind of short weapons, like trauma weapons as well, because also you have to fight against other armored opponents. So the physicality of this warfare is pretty evident, and it's gonna enhance. It's a moment of transition, as you understand, in which artillery plays its important part. Let's say that from the 20s of the 15th century, basically any updated European prince had to have his own artillery in a way or another, if he wanted to be cool and defeat his enemies, because otherwise, and not everybody could. That's the real problem. So this also favored in part the process of political certification. Also of social certification. So that's why monarchies at this time also get reinforced, and they achieve a greater centralization, chiefly because the organized army of the prince was something way more powerful than all the divided, scattered lords that could still do something about that, but didn't have quite the same proto-statal apparatuses of this monarchies. So, as we were saying before, there was this other problem, is that of the range of the artillery, that necessarily exposed the same to the fire of the defenders during sieges themselves. Naturally, usually those who are besieged have kind of a better time than those who were not, in the sense that aside from fire, artillery fire, stuff like that, still there is this main evident main tactical advantage posed by the fact that you're inside and you're also up usually, and you have a greater chances to repel the enemy than the enemy to storm your position. So at this time, as we were saying, artillery isn't still capable of making the big difference. It's starting to make it though, and but nevertheless, the defenders still have some edge with their guns, with their crossbows, etc. So if you approach artillery too much, well, you may have, and in fact, since actually it's not that now artillery was doing something very different what was done before, because usually, even previously, normally the armies didn't approach the enemy walls more than in, let's say, up to a crossbow shot, fundamentally, of distance, because that was in fact the moment where the enemy could unleash hell on them, because crossbow fire and then eventually handgun fire was definitely used in a concentrated fashion, especially crossbows still at this time. Crossbows kind of fell out of use practically into the mid-16th century, at least into actual warfare, but let's say that they were still out there for some consistent time. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. Proving in fact how long artillery took to develop in an effective fashion uh, to outclass it, fundamentally um, to surpass it as a weapon, even though naturally, say during the 16th century, crossbows were still not a big thing. I mean, kind of artillery had from the beginning of the 16th century had already got the upper hand, if not already before, but I don't want to exaggerate. Let's say, however, that also the enemy had other cannons mounted on the walls. Today we will not look at the defense. Today we mostly look at the attack. But this was happening from both sides. By the way, consider that fortifications at this time were definitely, it's true that they weren't kind of still being built to actually use to mount artillery in it. Next time we will see how this adaptation was taking place already. But let's say that the majority of fortifications were kind of still the old-fashioned, and especially they were very composite. So even especially these first guns were relatively small and etc. could be moved here and there, and therefore it made everything more complicated, because at that point it's not even a matter of you can't even have a single tower, a bunch of towers in the nearby, and they can't support each other with concentrated fire, etc. So this is also the concepts that are to form the new fortress plans plans that take into consideration the opportunity of creating kind of dead corners or area where the enemy concentrates, you can shoot on from several directions, and stuff like that. So problems were relatively symmetrical from one side or the other. Guns were used from both sides at this point. It is true, though, that think about the siege of Constantinople. The Theodosian walls at that time were basically unfit for lodging artillery. They had resisted for 1,000 years against any kind of enemy, but and they were still pretty formidable for the same Ottomans to storm, actually. But what the Byzantines had tried was to lodge certain guns they had on their own same walls and shooting from there, and they realized they were actually the recoil was damaging the same wall. So this was a kind of a problem that made, I think, obviously on average, the besiegers to have larger, more powerful guns than what the defenders usually had. So warfare was evolving towards a direction that would favor naturally the field armies, and then the fortresses. In fact, during Renaissance warfare, this is what you have strategically all over Europe: the shrinking of the number of fortresses, and kind of the dynamization. I mean, artillery, the increase in strategical speed, because now artillery could take to the ground something you up to the previous century you would have had to waste months of siege with. So now the important thing was, the emphasis was put on how this army actually worked, even in other contexts. Even there were more frequently pitched battles than before. Essentially now, because armies could move more quickly, and that's how also field artillery was starting being developed, or at least how the one existing was adapted also to those tactical functions. And there were many ways, however, were used to absorb the artillery bombardments in a way or in another. So artillery was becoming also a very valuable asset in some way. So they for defending artillery, there were large bodyguards, bodyguard units attached to them. They were definitely defended, patrolled. There were naturally sorties. Now they were aiming at knocking out these cannons, and therefore this increases also the amount of men that are necessary to man these guns, not just for their crews but also for their for those who are going to defend them. It's at this point that also other type of guns are being created for creating things like repeated fire, like continuous fire. Like think about the organ like guns that could shoot more projectiles at once, which is a form of mitraille, if you want, in order to that was designed primarily to chop down, to massacre infantry that could advance from the walls, which is kind of cool because imagine now that we've seen that distances between the armies and the fortresses, the besieging armies and the fortress, weren't so large. So even by putting some of these repetition guns in front of the gates of the enemy, you could say, okay, come out of here, see what happens. And so there were clever ways, and in fact until the 40s of the 19th century, fundamentally the best way to defend artillery was still mitraille, so using artillery to defend artillery. Then afterwards rifles began to outshoot in range artillery, so that's where machine guns were invented, but that's another story. Yeah. At the same time, there were also strictly material problems in terms of resisting the enemy fire as well. So sometimes there were things like bags, like piles of faggots or stuff like that were stocked all around the guns, also with some argents on the ground, thick curtains in wood that were still used actually since crossbows came around, but even before, naturally, and therefore there is all another, let's say, other components that are necessary to field artillery, not just for artillery itself, but also for the people who have to man it, who have to stay under fire. So in fact, when you see even in some of the pictures that I'm using now for the background, is all these thick curtains of wood from behind which soldiers shoot, etc. Obviously, the wood curtain doesn't stop a shot like the one we saw before, 50 kilos that are raised, but it's still better than nothing, and especially against crossbow bolts. But even handgun shots, that's still something you can do. So you have usually these very cinematic, gloomy pictures of 100 Years' War battles where everything is kind of in France, kind of this dark skies, and all these shining soldiers with plate armor, brigantines, and pole axes behind in the smoke with crossbow bolts flying, and this wooden curtains pretty much everywhere. That's usually the stereotypical picture of medieval warfare we get. Mostly, it's in fact it's proto-modern warfare, if we want. That was really it, and it must have been spectacular, by the way. And as we were saying before, especially the 100 Years' War towards the latter times, so a very consistent amount of siege warfare, exactly because of the development of artillery that made it now more dynamic, more viable, especially for the French. And towards the end of the Middle Ages, thanks to artillery, you could even surprise the enemy so suddenly and so rapidly to obtain great successes. And there is a witness here from the wars of Italy. This is a Florentine that comments on French artillery, and he says, now let me translate in a decent way. It says, when a stronghold is taken, the horses are withdrawn. You change the direction of cannons that eventually are pushed, are toted ahead progressively, at the point that in a single day they can arrive within under the walls, under the only protection of the carriages, of the wagons, because some of them were naturally shifted now this time with wagons as well, especially the heaviest ones. And when you get to the bombardment, 30 or 40 pieces make open fire, so that the walls are quickly reduced to debris. The French say that their artillery is able to open a breach in an 8-foot wall, an 8-foot deep wall. Let's say an 8-foot thick wall, and even if the breach is small, their number is great, because starting from the moment in which you begin, you don't stop for a single instant, nor during the day nor during the night. So here is stressing fundamentally that naturally bombardments were continuous. This is actually the case of all artillery that has been ever employed. I mean, if you study sources about how trebuchets were used, that was the same thing. Sometimes one tactic was to bombard the enemy continuously, not to make him fall asleep. So maybe you could storm a castle just by, because the people inside it couldn't sleep, and not because they were actually, weak in other ways. So there was a lot of psychological warfare involved. And here is saying especially that the Florentine witness is saying that even if breaches were small, so that walls were still something, were still a thing, despite the French claim that their artillery now can breach even an 8 feet thick wall. The number of these breaches is high. So you have several places where the breach is caused. So even if it's relatively narrow, you can get in several ones. So in entering in, and yeah, there are other episodes, other military episodes, like the storming of the city in Castle Couchy in 1487, that actually support this analysis. And there is even a treatise that is written kind of shortly afterwards by Philip of Clèves that claims that cannons have to be deployed in battery at not more than 30 or 40 steps from the ditches, keeping so this is a kind of a very short distance, and I understand whether the ditches are I don't think it's the ditches of the same city, because 30 or 40 steps is actually very few, so I don't really know at this point, but it also depends on what but yeah, I think from the ditches of the same besieged city, because here the Florentine writes basically the same. He says that the carriages could be in fact move up to the under the enemy walls basically, and Philip of Cleves says that these guns have to shoot roughly 40 shots a day, I believe singularly, and that's why he's talking about a battery. So this is a pretty concentrated fire, very close range. So in 24 hours, given that, as we have seen from the Florentine witness, bombardment lasted day and night, you could shoot in this way up to 1,000 projectiles over the enemy stronghold. So this is actually a massive fire that is being reached now pretty at the very end of the Middle Ages, that in a certain sense also explains to you why people think that the Middle Ages kind of stopped it there, because definitely artillery didn't cause it, but it was still a factor that accelerated a certain transformation in warfare, and it definitely had some impact on the way also the whole politics and military history, political military history actually went. Just a word on Philippe de Clèves that we have mentioned. He was actually a Burgundian. He was lord of. He was born in 1459 and died in 1528. So he kind of saw this late 15th century developments and early 16th warfare, etc. And he was lord of Ravenstein, Vinedaele, and Enghien. He was admiral of the Netherlands, and he was fundamentally a noble and a military leader of the of Burgundy, or what was Burgundy also at the time. He was actually a counselor of Maximilian I of Habsburg, because you know that this is the time where fundamentally the Duchy of Burgundy is conquered by the French, but the Burgundian Netherlands pass by as a dynastic inheritance in the hands of the Habsburgs. So you have now this combination of this Austrian dynasty, military and culture that was fundamentally feudal, with this other world that was instead way more advanced, more urbanized, more economically dynamic, also politically autonomous. Actually, the Habsburgic Netherlands weren't very happy of anyone interfering in their affairs, nor the Austrians, nor eventually the Spanish. But that's this history, and it's important because, in fact, for the same Habsburgic history, because you find these individuals that now came from areas that were traditionally different from the ones of the Habsburgs, at least here. Taking the map of the Holy Roman Empire, that kind of diametrically opposed. The Netherlands are in the northwest, Austria is in the southeast, so it's kind of there's all Germany in the middle, so it's not really the same thing. And he was actually a bold military leader. He was initially at the service of the Valois Dukes of Burgundy, actually. He eventually passed. In fact, he lived this transition in first person into going to serving the Habsburgs eventually. And there would be a lot to tell about him as well, but nevertheless, maybe for today it's better if we stop here. I've made now several videos actually about late medieval siege warfare, which is kind of cool because I've never been a great fan of artillery. I mean, I love artillery, especially in the 18th century stuff, but from the 18th century onwards, especially with Gribeval and Napoleon, etc. But it's I tend to dismiss it. I mean, I prefer to explain more. At this time, artillery is not really a decisive factor. It actually never will. It starts, however, becoming a determining factor, really, and to make a difference. So I'm saying this because I'm very, I'm very critical of the term of military revolution of the modern age, because in my opinion it didn't happen at all. It was nothing like a revolution. It took like, just from the came out from Renaissance warfare to the 18th century, just passing from pike formations to full musketry, from musketeers formation, it took 200 years, fully. And artillery also was around since the early 14th century, and it's not something that it dramatically improved. I mean, from a sheer technical point of view over the years until very late, especially in the 19th century. So the idea in general is that you have to look at artillery as a complement of a warfare that was evolving by other means alone, and more as a consequence than actually a cause. Always given that it's like everything, it's kind of the same thing both things at the same time. Nevertheless, by making these videos, I realized more than changing my judgment about this, which really didn't, but actually it tells you, however, it kind of precises the importance that such weapons had, and their purpose, and the problems now that these the late medievals were facing, for which reason they were developing these guns, and how they coped with the technical difficulties, with logistics, etc. And the picture that appears is fundamentally the picture of an extremely dynamic employment of these guns. Like, not the... I mean, of course, technically they were... we've seen they were kind of poor, generally, but, well, thanks my eyes. I mean, that was the late Middle Ages. Technology was what it was, but nevertheless, for that level technology, the employment was extremely dynamic. And you see how this was... there were very clever and intelligent ways to use these guns that were known at that point by everyone, because guess why? It's not that humans are, there is the idiot who doesn't know how to do things, and the other one who got it all, right? Especially when we're talking about human groups. You see that the employment of artillery was kind of very similar everywhere, and that the main differences only came essentially from the political and social differences, or cultural ones, because it depends really. There were also kind of differences in Europe, especially as we were saying at the beginning of the video, in terms of areas of production, but there were other also cultural limits that are more evident, I would say, in the Muslim world. Actually, if you look at especially the Tartars and the great distrust they had against gunpowder, black powder in general, and instead the Ottomans, that albeit being very relatively respectful towards the Khans of let's say the Genghis Khan's heirs, they developed artillery relatively soon. Also the Mamluks did at the beginning. So what you see is actually that the more the power is developed and centralized, and the more artillery is applied. Also because usually if a power has those characteristics, it's generally because it's an expansion. In fact, you see, and explained that also in that video made on the Mamluks, the Mamluk armies, that by the Ottoman conquest of Egypt in the early 16th century, actually the Ottomans were already, pretty much ahead in artillery use than the Mamluks, despite having risen very, very recently as a power compared to them, and also from more backwards backgrounds compared to the Mamluks, and also in terms of resources and so on. So it's very interesting how every power kind of modulated the introduction of this. For instance, England, especially after the end of the crisis that broke out after the end of of the 100 Years' War and all the economical problems, etc., for consistently for centuries at that point. I think until the English Revolution, as a matter of fact, in the 17th century, it lagged consistently behind compared to continental powers. Like the English had usually to import things like, in fact, this new artillery, guns, even horses actually. So it's important to look at also the resources of a country and say, okay, where we can develop. For instance, the Italians pioneered in many ways artillery in Europe for some time. Ferrara was a very important center of artillery. Or seemed the Venetians had very clever naval use of naval artillery and so on. But being kind of smaller city-states, republic, never quite developed those quantitatively more than qualitatively those large siege trains that instead, in fact, Charles VIII brought into Italy with starting the 80 almost 70 years Italian wars that engulfed Europe, with this siege train that basically made him crossing the peninsula unopposed and smashing every town that he found, that the very few ones that opposed his advance. So these are all factors that have to be kind of considered, because French artillery, for instance, remained kind of the regarded as the most advanced one for kind of forever. Because let's be honest in here, the main power in Europe in terms of strictly terrestrial military interests was France. During the 16th century, I mean the second half of the 16th, first half of the 17th, they were engulfed with the wars of religion. But with the Roi Soleil and even the 18th century, it was normally France, since the 15th century they had kind of the best artillery, and that made it more extensive use of it. Even the Spanish, but the Spanish during the wars of Italy, kind of it kind of surpassed the French at the end of the day with their own tactics that definitely used artillery. But the Spanish didn't have the best artillery, but they still combined other tactical elements in a way that they were regarded as the strongest army in Europe. So this for saying that artillery is not, if you have artillery, you win. As a matter of fact, it's very, very, very different. And even if you look at the history of Europe, of colonialism, especially during the 18th century, where you have this, consistently developed European statal armies expanding in other continents like Asia, like America, and so on, you see that at that point the technological edge is, as always, by the way, is kind of not really an influence, but it's still very, very relative. Also because a question of terrain. Just think about, European battlefields are something. Fighting in Central America or in tropical areas, it's not really the same thing. So even there you need something else, and the Europeans also got crushed sometimes at this point, in spite of their artillery, by populations that were considerable as primitive, etc. So just remember that technology is never the answer. The technology is nothing without doctrine. If you don't have doctrine, you can have the best technology, but you ain't going to do anything with it. So that's the moral of the story. That is kind of always the most important thing, actually, to understand military history. At least one of the most important things. So, okay, for now I really stop. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.